Hi everyone, so this week we're discussing Soundscape, Soundscape, Ecology, and then Acoustemology. And I think how this is going to work is the questions for discussion. I put all of those on the slides, and then I'll be kind of discussing my own thoughts about it as I discuss the reading. So, beginning with Schaefer and the Soundscape, Schaefer is, or was, I believe he passed away. He was a Canadian composer and writer and music educator, um, and he is attributed with coming up with the term soundscape. And I think the first question that I found really interesting with him, from I think page 3 of the PDF, is he wonders if the soundscape of the world is beyond our control and we're participants in that soundscape in a different way and we're more of an audience, or if we are the composers and the performers of the world soundscape responsible for giving it form and beauty. So that's coming from page 3 of the PDF. And I was wondering, just reading that, who Schaefer considers as composers and performers in that we statement. Um, I'm wondering who is included in that we. Who gives this soundscape form and beauty, and who doesn't, or who isn't included in that. Um, yes, and then when he discusses macrocosmic composition, I thought it interesting. I thought it was interesting that when he references this quote from John Cage at the top, music is sounds around us, whether we're in or out of concert halls. John Cage is referencing Thoreau there, and if you're not familiar with Thoreau, he was a transcendentalist influenced by Romanticism, and he often called the woods his symphony and referred to nature as his cathedral, so a lot of religious and musical and kind of elements of the sublime in his work. Um, he was very fascinated by the idea of wilderness, and if you haven't read his famous piece Walking, I would recommend it. He is kind of controversial today in his ideas, um, in terms of how he discusses wilderness and culture and, yeah, kind of nature as like a gendered, racialized, colonialist process, is present in his writing, but I think there's a lot of connections there, with how he connects the sublime to music and concert halls, and also very sweeping, vast landscapes and more wild symphonies. Um, so, if you're familiar with Thoreau's work, I'm curious how you saw Schaeffer's ideas of the world as a macrocosmic composition to be similar or different to Thoreau's ideas. Um, and then, similar to that, in and outside of the concert hall, I'm wondering if you think that all sounds can belong within the comprehensive dominion of music. And I think the way he frames this, I think the can is a really important element of this question, because for me, I see sounds belonging within the dominion of music as a possibility, but not necessarily a definite thing. Um, I think in the proper contexts, and we can debate what that means, um, that any sound could be included in music. Um, Obviously, very jarring and like kind of scary sounds would possibly create a different type of music than one might initially picture, but I think there is place for that there. Um, and then Schaefer also discusses, how a soundscape consists of events heard and not objects seen. And this one I had a bit of trouble interpreting. Because, like, if you're out in Lakeshore Nature Preserve, you hear the birds, but you can't see the birds necessarily. And thinking about music more broadly, I'm wondering if sound or music can ever portray an object. Um, I'm not entirely sure what this would look like, especially in the Western canon. Um, but I would be curious to see how that's even a possibility if it is. Um, and then he also discusses origin stories of music. So I am curious. He discusses a lot with the Greeks and Greek origin stories through the allos and the lyre. So that's music as subjective emotion versus sonic properties and the material of the universe. So looking at other cultures, I'm curious what other origin stories of music are present there, if there are any present there. Because definitely like the Greek origins of music is what I was taught in music history, but I'm wondering if there's other origin myths that aren't as commonly taught, at least in the university setting. So that is the first kind of conversation about Schaefer. Um, and if you want to discuss, feel free to pause my kind of narration at any point. But I'm going to move on now. And then he also discusses the tuning of the spheres, and I think this is just an interesting image of what that looks like. So he discusses the earth with the strings and like the celestial kind of godly hand tuning them. So everything is very in like harmonious balance. But yeah, that's just the image of what he was discussing. Okay, and then moving on to keynote sound signals and sound marks. A question I had there is what a sound mark of Madison would be. He discusses a sound mark as a sound unique or specially regarded by a specific community. So a sound mark that I've been thinking a lot about are the new airplanes. I think like the F-35s. That's probably not what they're called, but the giant jets that are making so much noise in the area, and they've been kind of contested. Um, I'm wondering if Jump Around could be considered a sound mark, even though it's like a musical composition in itself, also. Um, so yeah, just an interesting question to think about. And then um, he also discusses keynote sounds as natural to the area's climate and geography. And then I've been thinking about this because some of my friends in the geography department would, I think, argue that in urban settings, signals can become keynote sounds and part of one's daily lived environment. So then we get into the discussion of like what's considered nature and what's not. Because like for me, I live right next to a fire station, so while they are signal sounds, they've become kind of natural in the at least traditional sense for me in terms of how I live. Um, yeah, I think sound and proximity is also an interesting thing to consider when we're talking about events heard and not objects seen, like the Niagara Falls example. Um, yeah, that was another thing I took away from the Schaefer reading. And then lastly, he mentions God as mystical, and then like how the divine was portrayed as sound or vibration before there was an image attached to the idea of God. Um, so I'm wondering if there's any correlation possibly between those like ancient beliefs and thought practices of the divine and then things we're seeing today like new agey sound healing frequencies and like sound bath practices. Um, Even if there's a relation to like good vibrations, good vibes. Um, it's kind of a loose correlation I thought of, but I'm wondering if there's any truth there. Um, yeah, but that's all I had on the Schaefer. Moving to the Ingold, um, I think the separation of landscape from multisensory experience of the environment was an interesting. He brought up um, multisensory experience is something he talks about in a lot of his writing. I've read a lot of his work on multi-species communities and like world making. Um, but yeah, experiencing the world through all of your senses, not just sight or sound. Um, yeah, we can't really slice it up, as he says, along the lines of sensory pathways by which we enter into that scape in general. Um, yes. So to Ingold, he mentions how sound is neither mental nor material, but a phenomenon of experience that is of our immersion and in commingling with the world in which we find ourselves. So I, obviously as an outsider, witnessed this in how the Kaluli people make sounds and music in Voices of the Rainforest. I love how it started with the slow sunrise and those like slowly transitioning images to fully encourage listening. And um, it was so cool how the Kaluli seemed to sing with all of the sounds together, kind of adding to the rainforest layers, and like other vocalizations by animals and even like the rush of plants. So I think this relates to what Ingold is discussing as sound being the medium through which we move, and kind of his thoughts on phenomenon of experience. Um, yeah, I thought his points on weather were also interesting, and like weather and embodiment, especially with the paragraph about wind. Um, so yeah, I'd be interested to see how people affected by wind embody it compared to others less affected. And I think what he means by affected um, can also be up for debate. But yeah, he mentions in sounding, and I think that kind of relates to his ideas of embodiment. Um, yeah, and like incorporation. So for me, I kind of interpreted that as like sound being situated in, produced by, processed through, and interpreted by the body. And you can't really separate those from sound. Um, yeah, so I definitely noticed some overlap with those ideas. But I've also noticed that he's a researcher that tends to make up a lot of words, um, and they sometimes can be hard to interpret. But yeah, um, moving on to Feld and Eisenberg, um, I think the song sung through bird voices was really interesting, especially in Voices of the Rainforest. So we talked about layers with Ingold of the way the Kaluli people kind of sing with the environment and nothing is really separate. Um, but I think in this way, when I think Ulahi was discussing the bird voices and Feld was kind of relaying this information about um, these distinguished voices in the landscapes because they're recognized as spirit voices and like what they represent for the Kaluli community. Um, Ulahi was mentioning how they link the living and the dead, present and past, human and avian, ground and treetops, and village and forest. Um, yes, and then she was talking about how they sing the world through watercourses, following the flight paths of forest birds. Um, and Feld mentions how Ulahi taught him how water moves through land, the same as voice moves through the body. Um, and I think it's really cool because Ulahi was the one who composed a lot of the songs in the documentary. Um, but there's a lot of multi species community things I'm noticing here, which is really interesting for me. But I think if flight paths of forest birds align with watercourses and birdsong as spirit voices, I think it makes sense that water and the voice are also connected. Um, and like for me, as a vocalist trained in the Euro Western sense, water and the voice are connected in other ways. So there's obviously hydration. I was like, I grew up with a straw technique, like blowing into the water to like air support. Um, and then I also used to imagine waves to learn how to breathe deeply to support my air. Um, and I think my first experience singing in a large multi school community in middle school, um, the first song we sang was called Water is Life. So I think those elemental relations are really interesting, especially in various cultural contexts. Um, yeah, kind of these elemental relationships of water and land and embodiment being ensounded in the body, kind of like Ingold was saying. So, my question related to that is how do you sing the world in your own musical practice? Um, I think it was cool what he was saying about songs being collective and connective. I think there's a lot of music making processes that um, can align with those same words of collective and connectedness with other humans and also the non human world and the landscape. Like, um, the Kaluli's relationship to water courses and flight paths. Um, I also thought what Ulahi was saying at the end of the documentary was really interesting about the cell phone tower. Um, she said, "We can't hear from the outside, our ears are closed." And that was when she was discussing her father dying because they couldn't reach anyone for air transport. So I'm also curious if they ever received a cell tower after that documentary. I couldn't find anything online. Um, but yes. I think in general, acoustemology is defined here as a way of knowing through a sonic environment. And I think that's kind of present through all of these readings. I think Kristen's going to make some of those connections across readings a little bit more. Um, it's kind of what P. Janowski says also about the relationship between a landscape and the composition of its sound. Um, but yeah, I think the most interesting thing I drew from Feld and Eisenberg was human place relations as subject subject versus subject object. This relates a lot to what I've been reading about relationality and reciprocity from various indigenous communities in the US. And I think Feld's use of the word poetic cartographies was also fascinating. And I was thinking about this in relation to the Capitala scene, the various scenes we discussed a couple weeks ago, as to like what extent this is possible in these environments and under these like ways of thinking about human world relationships, if it's possible to even return to a subject subject view of the world. So those are my questions for this week. I'm sorry this video was a little long, but hopefully this was a little bit helpful for you all, and I think Kristen will be able to provide more. All right, thank you. See you next week.